What happens when a young man, wrongfully accused and with no lawyer, decides to fight back against the system? Watch as Tyler Reed takes on a corrupt justice system, proving that the truth always finds a way out, even when the odds are stacked against you. If you believe in standing up for what's right, hit that subscribe button now, because this story is just the beginning. You won't want to miss how Tyler fights back against the system. It was a crisp morning at the Atlanta County Courthouse, the kind of day where the city's historical red brick walls gleamed under the early morning sun, and the sound of traffic hummed in the distance. Inside the courthouse, the air felt thicker than usual. The sounds of murmured conversations mixed with the tapping of shoes on marble floors as people shuffled to their designated rooms. At courtroom 306, the usual hustle and bustle were in full force. Lawyers and defendants roamed the halls, the anxiety palpable. But today, there was an edge in the atmosphere that seemed to pierce through the otherwise calm environment. Today, Tyler Reed, a 20-year-old black man from the west side of Atlanta, was about to stand trial for a crime he didn't commit. Tyler had grown up in the rougher part of town. His mother, Sharon Reed, a hard-working single mother, had done her best to keep him out of trouble. But Tyler had always been different. He wasn't one for the street life that so many of his peers fell into. He spent most of his time reading books, particularly about law. At 14, Tyler began to devour legal cases and legal textbooks. By 17, he had read up on constitutional law, criminal procedures, and even the intricacies of courtroom proceedings. He could recite the Miranda rights word for word, but as fate would have it, none of that knowledge could have prepared him for the day he was falsely accused of armed robbery. Tyler had been walking home from his local grocery store when the police swooped in on him, a mere 15 minutes after the robbery was reported at a nearby convenience store. He had been an innocent bystander, walking on the street with nothing more than a plastic bag filled with groceries. But the 911 caller had misidentified him, describing the suspect as a young black man in a hoodie. The description could have applied to hundreds of men on that street. But Tyler was the one the police picked up. He was arrested on the spot and charged with armed robbery. The only evidence against him was a vague eyewitness description, no fingerprints, no weapons, no real connection to the crime scene. Yet he was tossed into the back of a squad car, booked into jail, and left to languish while the system churned forward. His public defender barely spoke to him during his pretrial hearings, and he was now facing the terrifying reality of standing in front of a judge, with the prosecutor determined to paint him as guilty. Inside courtroom 306, the defendant's table looked too big for the young man standing beside it. Tyler stood there, his posture tense but his eyes focused, holding on to the deep-seated knowledge that he was innocent. Judge Samuel Grant, an elderly white judge with over 40 years of experience, sat at the bench. He had seen countless cases, and the vast majority were not cases of young black men wrongly accused. It was a reality he'd been conditioned to dismiss, a reality he'd grown comfortable with over his many years in the courtroom. Judge Grant, with his weathered face and silver hair, looked at Tyler with a mixture of detachment and indifference. Tyler Reed, in his oversized suit and sneakers, seemed like any other teenager, someone who didn't belong in a courtroom, much less defending himself. With a dismissive glance, Judge Grant banged his gavel. "Let's get this over with, shall we?" he said, his voice thick with the impatience of a man who had seen it all. Tyler glanced around the room. The gallery was full, journalists, spectators, and even a few curious onlookers. He caught his mother's eyes in the back row, and she gave him a tight smile, the fear in her eyes betraying her composed expression. Tyler took a deep breath. This wasn't the life he envisioned for himself, but the moment had arrived. "Mr. Reed," Judge Grant began, peering down at the young man, "you're accused of armed robbery. Do you have legal counsel, or will you be representing yourself?" The question hung in the air, almost mocking. It was rare for someone of Tyler's age, especially someone with his background, to represent themselves in a criminal case, and it was rare for a judge to allow it. Most people in Tyler's position wouldn't even dream of challenging the system on their own. But Tyler, with the knowledge he had accumulated over the years, was undeterred. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor," Tyler said, his voice steady, even though his heart was pounding in his chest. There was a murmur in the courtroom. The judge, surprised by this response, looked down at the paperwork in front of him and then back at Tyler. "Very well," Judge Grant said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Let's see how well you do with this, then. I'll grant you the right to represent yourself. But don't waste my time. This isn't some mock trial you play out in your head." The courtroom fell silent. Tyler's words were simple, but his resolve was clear. He was ready to challenge the very system that had wrongly accused him. The prosecutor, Thomas Walters, rose from his seat, his navy blue suit pristine, his demeanor cool and calculated. Walters had a reputation for being tough, relentless in his pursuit of convictions. He knew how to win. He had sent dozens of men to prison, and he didn't expect this case to be any different. "Your Honor," Walters began, his voice booming with confidence, "the state will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Mr. Reed, is guilty of the crime of armed robbery. The evidence is clear." He paused, letting his words linger. He glanced toward the jury before continuing. "On the evening of the robbery, the suspect was seen fleeing the scene on foot, running in the direction of Mr. Reed's residence. The 911 call identifies him as a young black male, matching the description of the perpetrator. The police found Mr. Reed walking down the street minutes after the crime was reported. His clothing, his demeanor, it all points to guilt." Tyler remained calm, his mind racing as Walters continued his speech. The prosecutor's argument was simple, too simple. It relied on a vague eyewitness statement and the convenience of Tyler being in the area at the wrong time. But Tyler knew this case was built on assumptions, not facts. His stomach churned with frustration, but he remained silent, letting the prosecution hang themselves with their own words. Tyler's turn came sooner than expected. He rose from his seat and walked to the stand, holding his head high. His hands were clammy, but his mind was sharp. The first witness, Marta Johnson, the woman who had supposedly identified him at the scene, was already seated. Tyler stood before her, his eyes locked onto hers. "Ms. Johnson," he said calmly, "can you please explain to the court exactly how you identified me as the man who robbed the store?" Marta shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable under Tyler's gaze. I saw him running down the street after the robbery. He looked just like the guy I saw behind the counter." Tyler raised an eyebrow. "So, your identification was based on what you saw from the back of the store from a distance?" Marta hesitated. "Yes, but would you say you were at all distracted during the robbery? Was it chaotic? Were there multiple people in the store?" The witness stammered, but Tyler didn't stop. He turned to the jury, speaking directly to them. "The prosecution wants you to believe that my client is guilty based on an assumption made by a witness who didn't even get a good look at the person she claims to have seen. How reliable is that?" Judge Grant's voice interrupted. "Mr. Reed, are you attempting to cross-examine your own witness?" Tyler smiled. "I'm attempting to show that this case is not built on facts, Your Honor, but on convenient assumptions. This is a mistake that could cost me years of my life." Tyler turned back to the witness. "Ms. Johnson, can you say with 100% certainty that I was the man you saw in the store?" She remained silent for a moment before answering reluctantly. "No, I can't." Tyler returned to his seat. The courtroom was quiet. The weight of his words had begun to sink in. This wasn't just a battle for his innocence. It was a fight against a system that operated on bias, assumptions, and stereotypes. Judge Grant's gavel banged down. "The court will reconvene tomorrow morning," he said, his voice stern. "We'll see where this goes from here." As Tyler walked out of the courtroom, his heart still racing, he knew that the battle had only just begun. His fight wasn't just for his own future. It was for everyone who had been wrongly accused, for those whose voices had been silenced. Tyler had made his first move, but now he had to keep the momentum going. The real challenge was yet to come. The morning after the first day of Tyler Reed's trial, the air felt thick with anticipation. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as jurors filed back to their seats, and reporters scurried to get their notes in order. Tyler could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. His first day had gone better than he'd expected. His ability to pinpoint the holes in the prosecution's case was beginning to show, but today, he knew, would be even more crucial. His resolve was stronger now. He wasn't just defending his innocence. He was preparing to expose a system that had failed him and countless others before him. It was no longer just about getting through the day. It was about doing whatever it took to bring the truth to light. Judge Grant entered the courtroom with his usual stoic expression, the gavel striking with finality as the proceedings began. He had witnessed countless trials in his time on the bench, yet something about this one felt different. The young man representing himself had caught his attention. Tyler's confidence was unshakable, and despite the judge's dismissive attitude, he couldn't ignore the impressive command Tyler had over the case. The judge adjusted his glasses, peering down at the defendant with a flicker of curiosity behind his usual stern gaze. The prosecution moved forward with their next witness, Officer Robert Harris, the officer who had been part of the team that arrested Tyler. The officer stood tall, his uniform sharp and immaculate, his demeanor authoritative. Harris had been the one who had physically placed Tyler in handcuffs on the street after the alleged robbery. His testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. Tyler watched closely as Harris swore an oath, his hand firmly placed on the Bible. The man had already set the tone with his testimony, confident that his version of events would be enough to convict Tyler. "Officer Harris," the prosecutor began, "you were one of the officers who arrested Mr. Reed, correct?" "That's correct, Mr. Walters," Harris replied, his voice steady. "And what did you observe when you approached the defendant that night?" "Mr. Reed was walking down the street, acting suspiciously," Harris answered. "He was near the scene of the robbery and seemed to be trying to avoid eye contact with me and my partner. We stopped him, and he became combative, resisting arrest. We placed him under custody immediately." Tyler's mind whirred as he listened. The officer's description was vague, and the actions he claimed Tyler had taken seemed exaggerated. He knew this was his chance. He stood up, his movements deliberate, drawing the attention of the courtroom. "Officer Harris," Tyler said, his voice cutting through the air, "can you tell me exactly how I was resisting arrest? What was my behavior like when you approached me?" The officer shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the directness of the question. "You were evasive," Harris replied. "You didn't seem cooperative." Tyler raised an eyebrow. "Evasive? You didn't think it was strange that a young man, walking home, would be evasive when approached by a police officer in a neighborhood known for high crime?" A murmur ran through the gallery. Even the jurors were visibly unsettled by the way Tyler phrased the question. Tyler could sense the shift in the room. Officer Harris hesitated, his discomfort growing as Tyler pressed further. "Let me get this straight," Tyler continued, taking a slow step toward the officer. "I was just walking down the street, trying to get home after a long day, and you decided that I was evasive because I didn't immediately greet you with open arms? Is that what you're saying?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but Tyler cut him off before he could speak. "And let's not forget the fact that I was arrested based on a description of a man who looked like me. Isn't it strange that the police would think that was enough to pull someone off the street?" Tyler's words hung in the air, almost palpable. The officer shifted uneasily, his usual confidence beginning to crack. Tyler could feel the tension in the room heighten. Every word he spoke was carefully chosen, his strategy unfolding before everyone's eyes. The courtroom was no longer just a place of legal formalities. It had become a battleground of ideas, and Tyler was gaining ground. "Let's talk about the arrest," Tyler said, moving to a nearby table and pulling out a set of documents. "Can you explain why, after you claimed I was resisting arrest, no physical injuries were noted in the report? No bruises, no signs of force. Yet, I was allegedly combative." The officer faltered, his eyes flickering down to the report in front of him. "There were no injuries," Harris admitted, but his voice lacked conviction. "But the situation was tense." "He was just walking home," Tyler interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "And you're telling me that a tense situation, with no injuries or physical force involved, justifies a public arrest based solely on a vague description? The room fell silent. Even the judge shifted in his seat, clearly intrigued. Tyler's questioning wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about exposing the flaws in the arrest, the assumptions that led to it, and the systemic issues in policing that made it all too common. "Your Honor," Tyler said, turning back to Judge Grant, "I move to dismiss the charges. There's no evidence linking me to this crime beyond the initial, flawed police report. I'm being held on nothing more than a hunch and a description that could apply to anyone." Judge Grant looked at Tyler for a long moment, considering his request. It was rare for a judge to grant a motion like that in such a high-profile case, especially when the police were so confident in their arrest. But Tyler's argument had raised valid points. The judge took a deep breath, tapping his gavel. "We'll proceed with the trial," Judge Grant finally said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "But I'll allow the defense to continue. We'll see where this goes." The courtroom exhaled collectively. Tyler had just taken the first step toward dismantling the prosecution's case. But he knew this was only the beginning. There would be more obstacles ahead. He wasn't just defending his innocence anymore. He was standing up against a system that had wronged him before he even had a chance to prove his case. That night, as Tyler returned to his modest apartment, he sat down with his mother, Sharon. She had been through so much in her life, but watching her son fight this battle was something she never imagined. "Ma," Tyler said, his voice quieter than it had been in the courtroom, "this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been treated like this." Sharon reached over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know, baby. I know. You just keep fighting, okay?" Tyler nodded, his determination unwavering. This case wasn't just about his freedom. It was about exposing the flaws in a system that kept people like him trapped. He had already made a difference today, but there was so much more to do. In the days that followed, Tyler spent every moment preparing for his next move. He studied the evidence, cross-referenced the police reports, and dug into the histories of the officers involved. The more he uncovered, the more certain he became that this case wasn't just a mistake. It was part of a much larger pattern of corruption and abuse within the system. And if Tyler could expose it, he could change everything. As he walked into the courtroom on the second day of the trial, he knew it wasn't just about proving his innocence anymore. It was about showing everyone in that room the truth about how the system had failed him, and how it had failed so many others before him. The battle was far from over, but Tyler Reed was ready. The days following the dramatic first session of Tyler's trial felt both like an eternity and the blink of an eye. With each passing moment, the gravity of the situation weighed heavier on his shoulders. His mother's anxious eyes never left him, always watching from the back of the courtroom, her face a blend of worry and pride. She knew her son was smart, but seeing him navigate this legal battle with the confidence of someone far older made her both terrified and proud. For Tyler, the stakes were personal. He wasn't just defending himself against a charge that could ruin his life. He was fighting to prove that the system wasn't blind, that it wasn't infallible, that there were cracks, flaws, and biases in place that had unjustly condemned too many people who looked like him. His mother had never pushed him toward the streets or away from school. She had always encouraged him to be more than his environment, to be smarter than those who wanted to write him off. And now, in the heart of the courtroom, it was all coming to a head. He was proving to himself and to everyone watching that he had a place here. He wasn't just a statistic. The morning of the second day of the trial, the courtroom was quieter than usual. The audience had gathered in anticipation, as there was a palpable sense that this wasn't going to be just another run-of-the-mill case. This was bigger than Tyler, bigger than his fight for justice. There was a sense that the system itself might be in question. As Tyler prepared for another round of questioning, he reviewed his notes in the small, cramped defense area. His fingers traced the words, the motions, the evidence he had painstakingly gathered over the past few days. He had used the recess to his advantage, piecing together the inconsistencies in the evidence presented by the prosecution. There were contradictions everywhere, from eyewitness testimony to the credibility of the police officers involved. But now, Tyler had to take it further. He needed to start building his case, the foundation on which his future rested. "Tyler, you've got this," Karen Davis, his public defender, said as she walked past him, offering a reassuring smile. "Just remember, stay calm. Don't let them get under your skin. You know the facts." Tyler nodded, though his nerves were still raw. He didn't expect Karen to understand the weight of this for him. This wasn't just about legal procedures. It was about proving that someone like him could stand up and change the narrative. It was about redefining what justice meant for people like him. As the court reconvened, Judge Grant entered, his gaze hard as usual. He had been watching Tyler closely since the previous day, noticing the young man's calm composure despite the intensity of the charges. But his mind was made up. He was going to let this play out. There were rules, procedures to follow. A young black defendant representing himself might seem unusual, but Judge Grant knew better than to let this trial turn into a spectacle. The law was the law. Court is now in session, the judge announced. "We will continue with the presentation of the defense's case. Mr. Reed, you may call your next witness." Tyler stood up from his chair, the full weight of the courtroom now squarely on his shoulders. He was no longer just a defendant. He was a lawyer in this moment, fighting for the truth. He walked toward the witness stand, where the next piece of his puzzle lay. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Officer Daniel Ruiz to the stand," Tyler said, his voice steady, but the slight tremor in his hand as he held the papers betrayed the nervous energy he was feeling. A ripple of murmurs passed through the courtroom as Officer Ruiz, one of the arresting officers, stood up and made his way to the stand. He was a seasoned cop, with a reputation for being strict and thorough. Tyler had done his research. This officer had a history of being involved in numerous arrests, but he also had a number of complaints filed against him for racial profiling. Tyler wasn't sure if this officer had been deliberately targeting him, but he knew he had to dig deeper. "Officer Ruiz," Tyler began, pacing slowly in front of the jury. "You were the one who arrested me, correct?" "That's right," Ruiz replied, not looking Tyler in the eye. Tyler pressed on. "You've testified that I was evasive when you approached me on the street. But can you explain how you arrived at that conclusion? What exactly about my behavior gave you reason to believe I was guilty?" Ruiz shifted, his gaze briefly darting to Judge Grant. Tyler could see the tension mounting. The officer had been expecting a typical defense lawyer to ask these questions, not a self-represented teen who seemed to know the law better than most people with years of experience. "Look, I'm just telling you what I saw," Ruiz said, his voice defensive. "The guy was walking fast, acting weird. I approached him. That's all." Tyler's eyes narrowed. "So you didn't consider the possibility that I was just walking home? That maybe I was just in a hurry to get somewhere?" The officer hesitated. "I wasn't sure at the time, but I knew something wasn't right." "Something wasn't right?" Tyler echoed. "What exactly does that mean, officer?" "Because I was walking at a fast pace on a public street. That means I was committing a crime." The prosecution's lawyer, Thomas Walters, stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is badgering the witness." Judge Grant looked at the exchange, but didn't intervene. "Sustained," he said, looking back at Tyler. "Let's keep this focused, Mr. Reed." Tyler took a slow, measured breath, his eyes locked onto Officer Ruiz. "Let's focus on the facts then. You said that I was acting weird, and that I was walking fast. But what you didn't mention was the fact that I had no criminal record, that I didn't match the physical description provided by the store clerk, and that I wasn't carrying any weapons. None of these facts were part of your initial report, were they?" The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I didn't think it was relevant." "Of course not," Tyler said, "because it didn't fit the narrative you were trying to create. You didn't think it was relevant that I was just a teenager on his way home from a store. You decided I was guilty the moment you saw me." The officer remained silent, his eyes refusing to meet Tyler's. Tyler felt a shift in the room. For the first time in the trial, it felt like the courtroom was leaning in his favor. Judge Grant watched the exchange unfold before him. He had seen it all before. Defendants who tried to challenge the system, tried to make themselves heard. But this was different. Tyler Reed wasn't just arguing for his freedom. He was exposing flaws in the very foundation of the justice system. And it wasn't going unnoticed. As the session wore on, Tyler continued his cross-examination of the witnesses, each piece of testimony building toward the larger narrative he was crafting. His defense wasn't just about showing that he didn't commit the crime. It was about showing how the system had failed him before he even had a chance to prove his innocence. His case wasn't just about his future. It was about the countless other young men who had been wrongfully accused, who didn't have the voice or the resources to fight back. Tyler wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for every person who had been treated like he had been. A number, a statistic, a case to be closed without thought, without scrutiny. He wasn't going to let that happen to him. As the day came to a close, Tyler sat back down at the defendant's table, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. The trial wasn't over, and there were still plenty of challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally doing something that mattered, something that could change the system. And it felt like he was just getting started. Tyler spent the following days poring over the case file, the police reports, and every scrap of evidence he could find. The more he dug into the details, the more the weaknesses in the prosecution's case became glaringly obvious. He had already uncovered discrepancies in the timeline, inconsistencies in the witness testimony, and holes in the arrest report that no one had noticed before. Tyler knew the prosecution would try to bury those inconsistencies, so he had to be ready to expose them at the right moment. The courtroom had become Tyler's battleground, and he was learning quickly how to manipulate the rhythm of the trial. He knew the judge, though experienced, wasn't used to seeing a young black man represent himself in a criminal trial. It was clear from the way Judge Grant looked at him sometimes, first with skepticism, then with a growing sense of respect, that Tyler was making an impact. He had become more than just a defendant. He was someone who could no longer be ignored. It was the morning of the fourth day of the trial when Tyler's strategy would be tested in the most unexpected way. The prosecution was growing desperate. They had already called most of their witnesses, and they had presented their evidence with the assumption that no one would challenge it. Tyler had already undermined their main arguments, making them look disorganized and ill-prepared. This day, however, would be different. The prosecution had one more surprise up their sleeve. The defense's case was strong, but it was about to face its most formidable challenge yet. The prosecution called Officer Michael Davies, an experienced investigator who had worked on Tyler's case from the very beginning. Tyler knew this officer. He had been one of the key figures in the initial arrest, and Tyler had already caught a glimpse of him during a few of the hearings. Davies was a veteran of the force, with over 20 years of service under his belt. His uniform was pristine, his hair graying but still sharp. His eyes, cold and calculating, didn't meet Tyler's gaze as he made his way to the stand. Officer Davies was the kind of cop who had been through the system for years, and he had no intention of letting a teenager, no matter how clever, ruin the case he had worked so hard on. "Officer Davies," Tyler said, standing and addressing the witness with a quiet, measured tone. "You were the lead investigator on this case, correct?" "That's right," Davies replied, his voice steady. "I reviewed the evidence and helped secure the arrest." Tyler nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he continued. "And what was your role in identifying the suspect?" "I was part of the team that responded to the scene of the robbery," Davies said, his words crisp and professional. "I helped track down the suspect based on witness reports and surveillance footage." Tyler tilted his head slightly. "You were the officer who reviewed the surveillance footage from the convenience store, correct?" "Yes," Davies answered, his eyes finally meeting Tyler's, though they didn't seem to carry any sense of doubt or hesitation. Tyler could feel the tension in the air. He had already reviewed the footage himself. He had memorized every frame, analyzed every angle. There was something about it that bothered him, something that didn't add up. The video showed a blurry image of the suspect's face, but it was not conclusive. What was more important was the timestamp on the video. Tyler had already cross-checked it with the police report, and he had discovered a significant error. The time on the footage didn't match the official record of when the robbery occurred. The video was out of sync with the timeline the police had presented. "Officer Davies," Tyler said, his voice calm but firm, "could you explain to the court why the timestamp on the footage you reviewed doesn't match the official report of the robbery?" The room fell into a hushed silence. Officer Davies's face tightened, his jaw clenching. He clearly hadn't expected this line of questioning. That's an error in the system," Davies stammered. "There must have been a malfunction in the equipment. The footage was processed in haste." Tyler shook his head, his voice unwavering. "An error in the system?" he repeated. "You expect me to believe that the video, which could prove my innocence, just happened to be out of sync with the official timeline? This is a robbery investigation, officer. Mistakes like this don't just happen, especially not in a case this serious." The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecutor, Thomas Walters, looked visibly uncomfortable. He had anticipated the defense making a challenge, but not one this direct, not one that would force them to explain away a critical piece of evidence. "Your Honor," Tyler said, turning to Judge Grant, "I request that the court allow an independent expert to analyze the footage and verify the timestamp. The integrity of this evidence is being called into question, and I deserve the right to ensure that no one is tampering with it." Judge Grant paused, glancing at the prosecutor, who had gone pale at this unexpected turn. The judge looked back at Tyler, his face unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though he might dismiss the request, but the weight of Tyler's argument hung in the air, and the judge could not ignore the implications of what had been said. "Very well," Judge Grant said, leaning back at his chair. "I'll allow the request for an independent expert to examine the video footage. But I warn you, Mr. Reed, we are moving dangerously close to a mistrial here. The evidence is still what it is." Tyler felt a surge of triumph, but he knew this wasn't the end. The fight was far from over. He had just struck a significant blow to the prosecution, but there were more obstacles to come. He needed to stay focused, to keep pushing forward. The independent expert was called on the following day, and the results were nothing short of shocking. The video had been altered, the timestamp had been tampered with, and the footage had been edited in a way that could not have been a simple mistake. The expert testified that the video had been manipulated to create a false narrative, one in which Tyler was implicated in the crime. This revelation was a game-changer. Tyler's eyes never left the expert as they spoke. The truth was finally coming to light. He had known all along that the system had been rigged against him, but now there was undeniable proof. The courtroom was abuzz with murmurs as the jury processed the revelation. The judge's expression was hard to read, but Tyler could see the shift in his demeanor. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a moment of reckoning for the entire system. As the expert's testimony sank in, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. The truth was undeniable. The video had been altered, and Tyler had been framed. The prosecution's case was in shambles, but the battle was far from over. With the prosecution now scrambling to recover, Tyler knew this was just one victory in a much bigger fight. The next steps would determine if he could break through the final layers of corruption that had been hidden for so long. Could Tyler expose the system for what it truly was? Or would the powers that be find a way to suppress the truth once again? The jury watched intently, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Tyler had exposed the lies, but now the clock was ticking. What would happen next? If this story has touched your heart, and you believe in standing up for justice, now is the time to act. Tyler's fight is more than just his own. It's a fight for every person who's ever been wrongfully accused, for every voice that's been silenced. If you want to see how the story unfolds, how Tyler challenges the system with everything he's got in Part 2, hit that subscribe button now. Don't just watch, be part of the movement for change. Like, comment, and share this video because together, we can make sure that no one ever has to fight alone. Thank you for your support, and stay tuned for what comes next. This fight is far from over.